A reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a big feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Drive out that slave woman and her son, for never will the son of that slave woman inherit alongside my son Isaac." The idea seemed very evil in Abraham's eyes because Ishmael was his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not hold it evil in your sight, not for the boy and not for your slave. Listen to all that Sarah tells you, for it shall be through Isaac that your offspring is reckoned. Still, of the slave too shall I make a nation, because he too is your offspring." So up rose Abraham early the next morning, and he took bread and a skin of water, and he gave them to Hagar, slinging them on her shoulder. And he gave her the boy, and sent her away. So she headed out, and wandered adrift in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the boy under one of the shrubs, and she walked and sat down across from him at the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "I will not watch the death of the boy." So there she sat across from him, and she raised her voice and sobbed. But God heard the boy's cry. So the angel of God called to Hagar from the heavens and said to her, "What is it, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has listened to the boy's cries, right where he is. Get up, pick up the boy, and take him by the hand, for a great nation shall I make of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin of water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy. He grew and lived in the wilderness and became a great archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got for him a wife from the land of Egypt. A word from God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. It is June 19th, 1865. A Union general arrives in Galveston, Texas, and a crowd gathers around to hear him announce that the war is over and all enslaved persons are free. A hush falls over the crowd for just a moment as black and white persons alike process this news. And then an explosion of sound, hollers and cheers, cries of joy, protests and questions. It turns out that President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years previously. But this is the first time the news has made it all the way out to Texas. Liberation for the enslaved people of Texas had been delayed. On the opposite side of the world, a good 3 or 4 millennia before that first Juneteenth, a different enslaved woman received news of her liberation. But I wonder if Hagar felt any joy at all when Abraham informed her that she and her son must go. The joy she should have felt at leaving her abusers at last would have been overshadowed by the pressing question, "Where will I go?" This was a pressing question for the newly freed Texans as well. Most of them had no desire to stay and work for their former captors, even with a paycheck. So they headed out to find family in Louisiana, Alabama, and other southern states, or they made their way north to seek a new life there. Hagar had no such options. The only route away from Abraham and Sarah led into the heart of the desert. Hagar knows that she's being cast out to die. She actually attempted to escape into the desert 13 years prior, forcibly impregnated by Abraham at Sarah's command, and then brutally beaten by Sarah as Abraham stood by. Hagar fled. On that first wilderness journey, Hagar did not cry out to God. After all, what good would the God of her oppressors be to her? But God does not care only for the pious. God does not act on behalf of only the believers who call on them. God comes to the pregnant Hagar, breaks the news that there is no life for her in the desert, so she must return to Sarah, but also promises never to abandon Hagar, and that one day her son would be free, wildly free, and the founder of a great nation. So Hagar gave God a name, El Roi, God sees me. And when her son was born, she named him Ishmael, God hears. And then, her liberation delayed, she spent 13 more years in the home of her abusers. And it's clear from today's reading that Sarah's jealousy and anger do not fade with time. Once she has a son of her own, Isaac, Sarah comes to see Hagar and Ishmael not only as signs of her own failings, but as a threat to her son's inheritance. So she demands that Abraham drive them away, forcing Hagar and her child to trade merciless masters for a merciless desert. And the question that burns hottest in my mind when I read this story is why? Why are Abraham and Sarah so merciless to this woman? These two are meant to be role models of faith, good people, holy people, blessed by God. In last week's scripture reading, we saw Abraham go to extravagant lengths to show hospitality to three strangers passing through. So why does Abraham fail to extend that kind of love and care to a member of his own household? Perhaps we can all relate to that somewhat. It is often easier to be kind to a passing stranger than to the people we share a roof with, especially those who are very different from us. We can accept difference from afar. We can be aware that differences don't make anyone inferior. We can even claim to wish for more diversity in our communities. But when difference actually comes, takes up space that we are used to having to ourselves, and little tensions begin to build as the more marginalized feel unheard and the more privileged get defensive, things can get nasty. So I wonder, is it Hagar's differences, her otherness, her darker skin and Egyptian heritage that numb Abraham's heart to her? The very name that Abraham and Sarah call this woman, Hagar, means the foreigner. They cannot be bothered to call her by whatever name her parents lovingly gave her. She is just the foreigner to them. She is just the Egyptian. She is just that slave woman. These labels reveal how Abraham and Sarah hardly see Hagar as human, and therefore unworthy of basic decency. When she can be useful, they can use and abuse her without a qualm. When she ceases to be useful and actually gets in the way, she can be cast aside with little remorse. Hagar's story has resonated deeply with African Americans across the centuries, especially with womanist theologians. Among them is Renita Weems, who calls this story of an enslaved woman's abuse familiar, even haunting, to African American female readers. Most importantly, she says, the relationship between Sarah and Hagar is proof that white and black women, although they share the same experience of gender oppression, are not natural allies in the struggle against patriarchy and exploitation. Sarah is only one rung up from Hagar in the social world of Genesis. Another womanist, Abra Love, notes how even though only one of them is labeled slave, both Sarah and Hagar are Abraham's property, to do with as he pleases. Sarah's one leg up is that she is Abraham's primary partner, of a higher class than Hagar. Just one rung, but oh, does Sarah use it to her advantage. She will plant her foot on Hagar's face and push Hagar further down, if that's what it takes to get a little higher up herself. We see this kind of behavior plenty in our own day. Look at how middle and lower class white people accuse immigrants of color of stealing all the jobs, instead of recognizing that if all the workers united in their shared struggle, they could make headway against the employers who exploit native-born and immigrant worker alike. Look at how on June 1st in Minneapolis, Ayanna Dior, a black trans woman, was attacked by a group of 20 black men. Faith Uncut tweeted about this incident. We're literally in the streets decrying the violence against black bodies. Those men could have been doing that, but they decided to side with the structures that seek to harm us. Thankfully, Ayanna survived the attack, and thousands of folks who do recognize her, not as an enemy, but as a comrade, have rallied to help her heal. Finally, look at how Harry Potter author and self-proclaimed feminist J.K. Rowling accuses trans women of not being real women, of invading women's spaces, of being abusive and predatory. Why can't she see that trans women are not her enemy, but her fellow women in the same fight against sexism and patriarchy. In cultures and communities across the world, across time, victims can become abusers. The oppressed can be oppressors at the same exact time. You would think that experiencing oppression ourselves would give us a little bit of compassion for one another, but instead we swallow the lies that our oppressors tell us, lashing out at one another in order to advance ourselves. Sarah accepted the lies on which her world was founded. The lie that because Hagar was a slave, her body could be exploited however her masters pleased. The lie that because she and Hagar had borne one son each to Abraham, they were natural enemies. The lie that inheritance and legacy are scarce commodities with only enough for one son. And so she is jealous of Hagar, and then fearful of the threat that she sees in Hagar's son. And instead of allowing herself to imagine a different kind of world, a world in which she and Hagar might be allies, teaming up against the patriarchy that traps them both, a world in which their two sons could share their inheritance, share in abundance, Sarah does what comes easiest for any of us. She lets her fear and hatred grow. She does not question the status quo. And so, when Ishmael dares to laugh, just enjoy himself on a day that's meant to be about her son, Sarah strikes. She commands Abraham to drive away her enemies, one young woman and one little boy. And so many readers from Jewish and Christian backgrounds alike have bent over backwards to justify Sarah's action. They seize onto that word, laughing, and suggest that maybe Ishmael was laughing at, mocking, teasing Isaac, even bullying or harassing Isaac. But the word in its simplest meaning really does just mean laughing. Sarah could not bear Ishmael's laughter, because to her, Ishmael was not just a little boy having a good time at a party. In her mind, he had transformed into a monster looming over her own son, putting her son's future at risk. In our day, too, little boys get painted as monsters. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy playing with a toy gun like little kids tend to do, transformed into a threat in a police officer's eyes. People are able to excuse the murder of this child and of other black persons at the hands of police because of what he was holding, or else because they were wearing a hoodie, or reached into their pockets, or said the wrong thing, or, look, it does turn out they have some sort of criminal record. But even in cases where the black person ends up actually being guilty of a crime, why does that excuse their murder before they can even stand trial? Even if Ishmael had been laughing at Isaac, even if he had been bullying Isaac, is that really a crime worthy of death by desert thirst for a 13-year-old boy? Maybe we rush to exonerate Abraham and Sarah because we know that God blessed them, that they are role models of faith. And if we start questioning their goodness, their morality, we're going to have to question a lot of the status quo and the people we put on pedestals. But God doesn't bless perfect people because there are no perfect people. Sometimes what our biblical role models are modeling for us is what not to do, how not to be. But it's hard for any of us to hold seemingly contradicting truths in tension. That good people can do bad things, and bad people can do good things. That someone who knows oppression like Sarah can turn around and persecute someone else. That the same person who is capable of beautiful kindness, like that which Abraham shows the three strangers, is also capable of enabling horrific cruelty. Have you heard the phrase, "there are no good cops," going around these days? I think that people's immediate rejection of that phrase stems from that same struggle to hold multiple things in tension. Many of us know a good person who is a police officer, and therefore we say there are good cops. But what the phrase is actually saying is that even a good person, someone who is kind and loving when off duty, someone who joined the police out of a desire to help the community, cannot be a good cop. Because when they serve that role, they are agreeing to uphold unjust laws, To be a police officer, you must uphold racist, ableist, sexist, queerphobic laws. It's part of your job description. You must be ready to show up to work and be told to put on riot gear, load up rubber bullets, and stand against peaceful protesters. Likewise, Sarah and Abraham might well be good people. That is to say that at their best, they do good things. They are faithful. They are devoted to one another. They practice hospitality. But perhaps the phrase no good cops could be applied to this ancient context, and we could say that there are no good patriarchs. Abraham might be a good man, but he is not good when it comes to the role of patriarch, the head of a household, because to maintain that role, he has to do unjust things. It's in the job description. To be a patriarch, he must wield power over other human lives, must hold them as his property. He must have children, and that means raping an enslaved woman. He must maintain order, and that means casting Hagar and Ishmael away. There are no good patriarchs. But I wonder, what if Abraham had rejected the role of patriarch expected of him by his culture? What if Sarah had refused the role of first wife, of slaveholder over Hagar? What if they could imagine a world where all their children receive an equal share in the family's abundance? A world where there are no slaves, but only fellow human beings who fight for each other's struggles as if they were their own. But Hagar did not live in such a reimagined world. There would be no reconciliation between her and Sarah. No equal share for Hagar's child, no safety and peace to be found in the house of Abraham. In order to experience liberation, Hagar had to leave, even if the way to freedom took her through a wasteland. I believe that is why God tells Abraham to heed Sarah's demand to drive Hagar away. Not because God accepts abuse, no, but because God knew that while Sarah intended this act for evil, it was the one path that could bring some good into Hagar's life. I'm reminded of the spaces that marginalized communities carve out for themselves in our world. When the mainstream world proves too hostile to them, communities of color build their own churches, their own universities. LGBT persons throw their own parties at bars and pride events. And in these spaces, even when they are hard-pressed for resources, the oppressed find a little bit of liberation from their oppression. And so it is with Hagar. She finds more life out in a desert than she ever found in Abraham's house. And that brings me to my favorite part of Hagar's story. For Hagar's first journey in the wilderness, she had no God to cry out to. For this second journey in the wilderness, she does have a God to cry out to. Hungry, thirsty, exhausted, Hagar finds a little shrubbery to shield her child from the sun, and then she sits down. She lifts up her voice, and God hears her cry, and God sees her, and God responds, gives her what she and her child need to survive, and eventually to thrive. Throughout the millennia, the truth of this God who sees and responds to the oppressed has never been buried for long. Like Hagar, enslaved Black people knew that the God of the white enslavers was their God, a liberator who would set them free. Like Hagar, do you see the God who sees you? Do you trust God enough to cry out and demand a response like Hagar did? And beloved, you know that I have to ask you the flip side of that question too. Do you know that God sees the ones whom you oppress? When have you been Sarah, knowing oppression yourself, yet perpetuating oppression upon others? When have you been Abraham, allowing that abuse to go on without interfering, and therefore just as guilty as the hand that strikes? The incredible news for all of us, oppressor and oppressed, and those of us who are a strange blend of both, is that when we are merciless, God comes with mercy. When we cry out for justice, God comes bringing justice. From the story of Hagar and Sarah, we know that God doesn't just see and hear, but feels feels deepest compassion that moves her to act. Even more amazingly, we know from the life, the death, and resurrection of God incarnate, Jesus of Nazareth, that God does not just see and hear, but experiences, is right there with us in the heart of our suffering, sharing our burdens when we are oppressed, and challenging us to a better way when we are doing the oppressing. Glory be to God. May we all live like we know that God sees and God hears.